Hello there, guys. It's me, Chase. Sitting out here on my backyard patio. I have to sit in the shade because it's actually kind of hot today, and you don't want to sit in the sun. Um, but the warm weather is nice. It's a nice change of things. And I love winter, but you gotta, the Lord doesn't give us just one season. He gives us many seasons, and wants us to enjoy each of the seasons. Uh, So I try to enjoy each of them when they're here, not complain about them. But I am I am in a spring mood right now, so it is kind of nice today. I'm trying to put this somewhere it's not gonna get scratched up, but also I just have to keep it with me. um, I wanted to I wanted to talk about. I've been sitting here reading. I've been reading my church history stuff. It's been really, really cool. It's a good overview of church history. This is volume one of Nick Needham's 2,000 Years of Christ's Power. Like I said, it's a good overview. It doesn't get into the in-depths of the theology and the letters. So obviously, if we were going to do that, you couldn't do that in this little thing. But anyways, yeah, I just got done reading Chrysostom's story, John Chrysostom, and it was one of the most. Now, obviously, it seems to me pretty obvious that Nick Needham is a fan of Chrysostom, so I think obviously he put a little bit of his, uh, maybe you might say romantic views of Chrysostom in there, but nevertheless, it did make me sympathize with Chrysostom immensely. Um, he's in just in this I've never really read into him very much, and I've just now. So this is my first time really reading into his life, and already he's become kind of my favorite of the early church. Um, I want to read more about him now. Um, I want to read his sermons and things. So it's his story is beautiful and sad. Um, and what I want to do is I want to use his story to talk about something. I want to use a particular moment in his life, towards the end of his life, um, to illustrate something here that is important to our current context. And so let me just say that, you know, back in those days, in the early days of the empire, so Chrysostom is late fourth, early fifth century. He dies in 407, I think, AD. So uh, in that time, there was a very that was sort of the what's it called, the prototype of the Middle Ages of governance, a magisterial government of church and state. Um, Hold on one second. I'll let my dog back inside because he wants back in. So a magisterial form of government, what that means is that you don't have what we have, obviously, which is a separation of church and state. One of the reasons we have the separation of church and state is to ensure that the errors and frankly unbiblical ideas of a magisterial government are not repeated here in the United States. That's one of the purposes. Um, it was not so that secularists could, glory in their secularism. That's not really the reason why that's there. Anyways, the way that things were back then was the governance was sort of a mixture or a combination of church and the emperor. Um, Bishops were a thing, they were very much a thing back in Chrysostom's day. He was a bishop, and he and the bishops had they were increasing in their power, frankly. until, of course, you have the Bishop of Rome and stuff like that. But the bishops were very powerful. They were getting more powerful, and Jerome was able to make the bishop, not the bishop, the emperor, pretty much submit to his will. That was pretty. I gotta say, I don't agree with that. I don't think that's biblical. But I do have to say, man, Jerome was a boss, man. He stood up to the emperor, who could have just had his head cut off right there and then. Stood up to the emperor in his time, and he wouldn't even let the emperor in his church because of his sin. He literally stood outside the door of his church, would not let his emperor enter into the church because of a sin that he demanded he repented of before he was allowed back into the church. I'm like, you talk about a man who's whether you agree with what he did or not, that's a man who has convictions, man. He will stand there and you'll have to cut him down to get him out of the way. But anyways, that's kind of like how it functioned. A lot of government functioned back then that way. So the bishop in a city had a lot of power, and Chrysostom was one of them. He was extremely popular in his city, and I'm trying to remember if it was Constantinople or not. Like I said, I literally just read about him, so I'm not exactly sure if it was Antioch or Constantinople. I think it was Constantinople, but which is now today Istanbul. But in that city, you have the emperor. What's his name? Let me get it real quick here. I forgot his name. His wife is Exodius. I think that's what her name. Exodius, something like that. We're gonna look it up real quick here, so I don't make a complete fool of myself. Arcadius was the emperor, and Eudoxia was like his wife, basically. And so Arcadius is the emperor, and his wife is Eudoxia, and she's kind of they're both pretty much really pagans. And Chrysostom was a Christian. And when you have a pagan emperor and a Christian bishop, that's typically a recipe for disaster, because you have two powerful parties in a city or in an empire with very different perspectives, and they're going to clash, and that's what happened with Chrysostom. The difference is, of course, Chrysostom's, he did not protest in a militant way. He protested in a faithful Christian way. He did not advocate any violence or anything like that to the abuse that he was given by these two terrible, wicked people. He did not respond didn't retaliate with the same kind of vengeance towards them. He just kept pastoring his church, the Church of Holy Wisdom in Constantinople. So, bottom line is these two people are Arcadius. Arcadius and Eudoxia had a big problem with Chrysostom. I mean, the attention got so bad that they eventually banished him, brought him back, and then he was banished again, where he died. And of course, the banishment caused a massive uproar, though. It caused a huge uproar with the people, because again, Chrysostom is extremely popular with his congregants and the people of Constantinople. He's very, very popular. They love to hear him preach. But he's not just kind of like he's no Joel Osteen. He's not that kind of guy. He's almost like the Charles Spurgeon of his day. Really, honestly, when you think about it, he really is like the Charles Spurgeon of his day. He was sort of a reformer in his day. He preached on the convictions of sin, to repent of sin, and just to be living better lives and things, as godly lives, truly godly and holy lives. People just love to hear him speak. And I wish I could have. But anyways, it got to the point where, just before his second exile, they got so fed up with him, they put him under house arrest. They barred people from entering the church, and just not allowing his church to function. I mean, they were just hell bent on ruining this guy's entire ministry. so they wouldn't allow people to gather in the church, and on the Easter, um, on one Easter, they try to prohibit the baptisms. Now, back in that day, you have to understand, back in that day, baptism was very different from where your typical evangelical sees baptism as today. They viewed baptism in a very, I don't know if I want to say, yeah, I guess you could say real sense. Baptism was very important. There's the idea of baptismal regeneration is a thing early on. It's pretty much a majority view. I guess I'm generalizing a lot. It was an extremely complex subject in the early church, one of the most complex subjects, I think. But I'm trying to just kind of keep it brief here. So important thing is that baptism was super important, and it was almost like partaking of the Lord's Supper. If you couldn't do baptisms, like the church can't even function, kinds like that. A Christian life can't even function really. So they were the city or the emperor has soldiers preventing people from entering the church on Easter to do the baptisms and things like that. And the people would try to do it anyway. And what happened was the authorities came in, and there was basically a slaughter. A lot of people died. The church survivors were chased out of the church. And on Easter, it was the church, Chrysostom's church, was vacant. It was just deserted. And people tried to do their baptisms elsewhere, but they were still hunted down and stopped and things like that. And there's just a big persecution happened. And eventually Chrysostom is banished. And then they banished him to a point where they basically made him walk to I forgot what it was called. I wonder if I can just pull it up here real quick. Early in 407, when Chrysostom dies, Arcadius and Eudoxia decided to intensify the misery of Chrysostom's exile by deporting him to the remote, inhospitable fortress town of Pitius. On the furthest eastern extremity of the empire, the military escort was instructed to show no regard for Chrysostom's well-being. So he was forced to march the great distance on foot and was deliberately exposed to a deadly combination of scorching sun and lashing rain. After 3 weeks of this treatment, Chrysostom collapsed, still some way from Pitius, at a hamlet called Bizeri. Racked with fever, his skin baked, as red as a brick, Chrysostom died within hours of his collapse, aged 58. His last words were, "Glory be to God for all things." This just broke my heart. It's just sad. It really is sad. I don't think I've ever felt for an early church father as I did Chrysostom, even Ignatius. I didn't really. I don't know why. I'm not sure exactly why. Maybe it was the way Chris Needham had introduced us to Chrysostom, or what. But his life really ended in sort of a tragic way, but in a glorious way. Just something to look up to. He really did finish his race, even though he didn't make it to his final exile point. He finished his race. So, anyways, the point I want to make here, because I was thinking about this as I was reading this, like I said, I'm at a point here as I sit here and I read and I think about these things, and I just kind of, it's a nice place to just sit and think, honestly. The backyard here, it's not a great view. It's just kind of, it's basically, still cleaning things up here, but it's a nice place to just sit and think. And as I think about this, what we're going through right now in America and really all over the world, but I can't speak much for the places that I just don't know. So here in America, how do I begin this? I want people to understand that I sympathize with my friends and my brothers and sisters on the side that just who absolutely are convinced that the best thing we can do right now is quarantine and things like that. I think you make a great point. I mean, I think it could be a good thing for us to do right now until we figure out what in the world's going on. At the same time, we have to recognize that people make, and I'm blessed right now because I guess I was one of the smarter ones of my generation who's put in a bunch of savings and still continue to put savings in right up to the point where the economy just shut off. So I have a lot of money in savings right now. They're just, helping me, but they're only going to last for so long. So, I'm hoping, because Governor Abbott, I believe, reopened Texas this week. So obviously that doesn't mean things are just going to instantly go back to normal, but hopefully gradually over time, by, the next couple weeks tops, things will be, for the most part, back to normal. Anyways, but there are people who you have to understand, there are people who can't afford to just do nothing. And you say, well, the government's going to give them money and stuff like that. But again, you don't really understand what that means economically. The more they have to print this money. They got to poof money out of thin air. And the more you're doing that, the more you're devaluing the dollar, the more inflation increases. Because the more you have of something, and this, again, guys, this is basic economics. The more you have of something, the less valuable it is. If you had, let's say, like I just got back from my dad's shop, I worked there, and we got a lot of really cool cars in there. A nice Porsche let's say we have a nice Porsche in there or something like that. We don't have any right now, but let's say we had one in there. And you're like, dude, this thing's sweet, man. It's like a 1969 nice classic Porsche. It's in great shape. And you look at that and you go, man, that thing's got to cost a lot of money. And it does cost a lot of money. Why? Because it's rare. It's a rare item. If you had thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands, millions of those things on the streets, in the same way you have Nissan Altimas on the streets, its value is worthless. It's basically another Nissan Altima. See, the more you have of a product, the more it's valued, it's devalued. And it's the same thing with the US dollar. The more you have of the US dollar, the less valuable it is. And therefore, the more you have to pay to get things, the more expensive things get, because it's no longer $1 that's going to get you something. It's got, because of the inflation thing and the demand of the markets, it's got to be $2 now, man. You got to give me more than just $1. It's got to be $2. And then pretty soon, I got to give you $3. Now you got to give me $10, man. I mean, this inflation thing. I'm sorry, it's not my fault. And it's not the fault of the retailers. It's the fault of what we're doing to fix our economic problems. Now, I didn't want to go too far into that, but that's basic economics, and that's so important. I'm not an economics professor either. This is logic 101. So you can't just just constantly be making money poof out of thin air and putting it into people's bank accounts. Because again, think about this. If you just like, hey, everybody just stay home, and poof, we'll give you your money, send it to you in a check, we'll put it in your bank account, whatever, direct deposit, whatever, you're gonna get it. And you go, okay, well, I got my money, so I gotta go to the store and I gotta get milk. But then you go to the store and you realize the store is closed. Why? Because they're staying home too. And then you got, well, maybe I got to go directly to the farm market, and then that's also closed because everybody's told to stay inside. And, see, when you halt the economy, you can put a legitimate pause on everything, but you're putting a pause on everything, everyone. And these are just things people just aren't thinking about. We cannot be a functioning society without a functioning economy. That's not greed. And in fact, the Bible promotes healthy economic growth. I mean, just look in Deuteronomy and how the Israelites were supposed to behave amongst each other and to trade with one another and even the outside world and things like that. A functioning economy is something the Bible promotes. So, these ideas are just simply silly. So, just to shorten it out here, that point, you can't just ask people. On the one hand, while I want to sympathize, and I'm not asking people who think that they should stay home that they need to try to force them outside and go to work, or arrest them, basically. I mean, that's not right. You have a right to not work if you don't want to work. If you feel like you need to stay inside, you want to just collect your check, fine, that's good. But on the other hand, you can't just be asking people and telling people you need to stay home, because not everybody can do that. I can't do that. That'd be nice if I could. It'd be nice if the Lord just suddenly, boom, podcast kind of goes, and then selling books and stuff like that. And that's what I'd love to do. It'd give me more time to do a lot of this stuff, but I'm not in that position. It's all in the Lord's hands. Whatever happens with that, it's not for me to make judgments on that. But in the meantime, I have to work. So, there's that. But the big point I want to make here is, if you, like I said, if you think it's best for you to stay home, then stay home. What you need to understand, what most of the people who are angry at the protests right now about the closing of America that are happening all over the country right now, these protests, I think Ben Shapiro said something really good. I think what the protesters should do is they should do the protests wearing their masks and maintaining a healthy amount of social distancing from one another. You do that by showing that's a civil disobedience. I'm going to follow the right precautions, and I'm going to gather. That way, when they force you to disperse, then it's all on them. It's not on you. You're like, I was following the rules. I did everything I was supposed to do. It's like that pastor or that Christian who got arrested at that abortion clinic. I forgot his name. His team and him were following all the right precautions. Now, they didn't have mandatory wearing masks at the time, so he wasn't wearing one. But he said that they were maintaining their distances and stuff like that. So he said, we're following all the rules here, sir. He says, you don't have any right to do this. Now, he wasn't resisting, but he was telling them, like, you guys know this is wrong. You know this is wrong. You should be going to the park, and making arrests, because apparently there was a park nearby where a bunch of kids were skating and stuff like that, and there was no regard for social distancing whatsoever. But the police were at this abortion clinic ready to arrest this guy. And so when you do that, you show who's really the bad guy here. And I think that's a good way to go about it. So do the protests, but wear the mask. Now, I don't have one, so that's why I'm staying here. Well, that's not the only reason why, but it's one of the reasons why I'm staying here. Because I want to be able to protest in a civil way, to disobey in a civil way. So, because it looks better on our cause when we do that kind of thing, when we do it that way. So, anyways, but nevertheless, the point here is, you look back at Chrysostom's situation and how hell-bent they were to prevent Chrysostom from doing what he does. You send soldiers into the church. You close it all down. And by what authority do they have to do these kinds of things? As far as I know, none. All of this was just on the whim. We got to get rid of this guy and do whatever it takes to get rid of this guy. And this is what happens as a result. Take that into our context today. That's what's happening right now when you think about it. Now, obviously, there's no bloodshed, obviously. But think about it. The same kind of thing is happening right now. And that's what I protest, absolutely. And like I said, what I was saying to people who are making fun of the protesters and things like that, and going, all these people care about is just their right to be stupid and blah, blah, blah. No, that's not what they're protesting. You guys are misunderstanding everything. They're not protesting the right to disregard. They're not protesting they're not going to these protests to say, and saying, oh crap, to hell with all the supposed experts. I don't care about what they say. They're not experts of me or anything like that. Man, that stinks. I just scraped up my book. Okay, well, it's just a book. They're not protesting so that they can just continue to be careless and try to just cause everybody else to get sick. The the essence of the protest is you don't have the authority to enforce these laws that you've made. Everybody should be on board with that. And if you think that the government ought to have the right to just willy-nilly make up rules as it goes, under the guise of the good of the community, well, go ask Chrysostom and see how that went. I mean, you guys are advocating, whether you want to admit it or not, you're advocating tyranny. And you go, well, they want what's best for us. Every single government that has ever tyrannized its people always justified its actions by thinking it was doing it for the good of those people. When the Roman emperors, like in the early, the 2nd century, I think, 2nd and 3rd century, the persecutions happening in those periods. You know why the emperors were doing the persecution of the Christians like that? Well, you know why they were doing that? It was for the unity and preservation of the empire. Those Christians were threatening that with this gospel of Jesus Christ thing. That's why they were doing it. So it was for the good of the empire. So the idea that they can just say, well, I'm doing it for the good of and the unity and the preservation of our society, that's not a legitimate reason. That's an end. And that's a good end, obviously. But just because you have a good end doesn't mean you got the good means to get to that end. And the reason why we have laws is to make sure you cannot justify the means to get to that end. That's why the laws are there. And that's why everybody should despise what the government is doing right now. This isn't about, my right to be an idiot and be disregarding towards my fellow man. I guarantee you, most of the people if you were to go and talk to most of the people who are doing those protests, if you talk to most of them are not going to say, I don't care about my neighbor, I'm just a selfish jerk, and I don't care if they get sick. None of them are going to say that. I guarantee it. Most of them are going to tell you what we're doing here is we're saying that the government doesn't have the right to tell me how to respond to this crisis or that crisis. That's my responsibility, not yours. That's what this country was founded upon. It was founded upon that ideal that you're responsible for how you respond to a crisis. And if you honestly think that, maybe you think that, people just don't know what's good for them. Okay, you may be right, but you realize what you're asking for, right? You're asking for the government to tell people what's good for them. No. That's not me. I'm responsible. And it is incredible to me to see the way people think like this. Who's the real selfish one? Who's the one who really thinks it's all about them and what they think? Because if you actually think that, the government ought to tell those people and all those people what to do, not me though, because I'm responsible. You are so naive. You are so naive. And you're more selfish than you like to think you are. You're probably, honestly, it's virtue signaling. This whole, everybody should stay inside because nurses and sympathizing with the nurses. I sympathize with the nurses. What is this idea of that you can't have both at the same time? I mean, it is ridiculous. But the issue here is not about my right to be an idiot. The issue is, where do we draw the line? Where is the government allowed to make certain actions and not? Now, I've said repeatedly, I've made an article about this on my blog, findingthebalance.net, called "The Precedent for Tyranny." And the argument I'm making is not that I'm granting you the premise that the government is actually honestly doing this for our good. Okay, let's grant that. Okay, fine. You can have that if you want. My point is that even if this government is doing this honestly for the good of its people, when you're letting it run rogue and not be accountable to the law, you set the precedent for future governments, future people who will take positions in the roles of government that these people, our current representatives, are taking a role in. Future generations to take those roles and go wild with them and go, hey, you know what, we're facing a crisis right now, and it may be a completely different crisis than what we're facing right now. It probably will be. But when you look in the past, we've been allowed. The people let us do some, just go off the cuff, not have total disregard for the Bill of Rights and the Constitution then. So we should be able to do that right now. If we were to do it in the past, let's do it right now. And see, that's the precedent you set. You open the door. That Pandora's box is open. And in my recounts of history, it's never closed. The only way it's ever closed again is by violence and bloodshed. And then after the violence and bloodshed is over, a new government is formed, one that's better. And we teach generations for a while about why this government exists and the importance of it. After a while, they just forget and become comfortable with the prosperity that results in all of that bloodshed. They forget, and generations come. I mean, the Bible teaches this, that Israel, over time, the people of Israel just forgot, just because they're not connected to the generation that fought and bled and suffered to get them what they have. They're just not connected with it. Let's just face it. That's the fundamental sin of mankind, is our forgetfulness. That's really what it is. Now, one final point here. In Chrysostom's day, again, Chrysostom, a really successful preacher, and his church got tons of money. He got so much charity work for it. What did he use that money for? He was a reformer of his day. He took a lot of the money that his church had. You know what he used it for? He used it to make hospitals. Built a bunch of hospitals. So who was making the hospitals? Who was making all the necessary medical care for people? It was the church. Doesn't that make you think that maybe what this country really, really needs is a reformation of the church and the Christian message in this country? It's one of the reasons why I cannot side with bare conservatism, because bare conservatism is just rules and principles without the gospel. Because you cannot, if you believe that man is fallen in his nature, and you believe what the Bible says about that fallen nature, that fallen nature rebels and rebels and rebels against authority and law, especially God's law, then having unregenerate, unchristian conservatives on your side, you can get some of them, sure, yeah, but you'll never be able to convince a secularized society to come to your side, because secularists are ruled by human autonomy, their own law, and they'll side with you right up until your values interfere with their own. And they're not you're never gonna have unity on that. You need a singular unifying message, and that singular unifying message is God's law, because God's ontology and the nature of his being is over and above man. He has the right to define who man is, and the only way people are going to obey that law is if they're converted as Christians. It's just the truth. Ezekiel 36, check it out. Ezekiel 36. God says in the new covenant, I will take out your heart of stone. I will give you a heart of flesh and make you to follow after my statutes. He's going to make you do it. He's the one who's going to give you that heart of flesh, that heart born of the Spirit that desires after God's law. It's only going to be a Christianized society. So one of our founding fathers, I forget exactly which one, I have an idea, but I don't want to make myself look like an idiot and say it, but I think it was, okay, let me just say, I think it was John Adams who said, this government or this Constitution was made for a religious people. It is wholly inadequate for any other. So, in other words, if I can summarize this last point, you first need to recognize that a secular society must demand that the government become the god. And then when that happens, you just have arbitrary law based on whatever the government's and whoever's in charge of the government decides is law. They're not held to accountable to any standard because they're the standard. So to avoid that, you need a Christianized society. It can happen, and it has happened in the past. It was the Christians, again, who created the hospitals, that took care of the sick. Why doesn't it happen anymore? It was successful back then. You get people who say, well, people are beginning to realize that the whole thing was false. Well, it was successful and it worked back then. It would still work now. So what's really changed? What's changed is us. That's what really changed. So, anyways, I've gone on way too long here. I just hope that, whoever listened to this for this long, I hope you get something out of it. Soli Deo Gloria, guys. God bless. Talk to you later. Bye.